I was at my GP's office the other day just for a routine checkup. He's one of those seasoned, highly respected clinicians, the kind who's seen it all, doesn't waste words. Anyway, we were just making small talk as he was finishing up, and somehow the conversation drifted to the general state of the world. And then he said something that wasn't in any medical textbook. He leaned back, with this look of calm, diagnostic observation and said, I've noticed a trend. Some people, particularly on the right, just don't seem to have inner lives. It was such a strange thing to say, really stark. And it didn't land like a political jab. It felt more like a clinical finding, an observation about, well, a new kind of human condition, maybe. And in that one moment, so much of what I'd been feeling, it just sort of clicked into place. This subtle, everyday pressure you feel from the world to be blank, compliant, to not have that messy, private, unconscious chatter going on inside, that feeling that your own mind isn't yours to inhabit, but, I don't know, a resource for others to copy or draw from. He wasn't just talking about politics, I realized. He was describing a quiet war, a war on the very idea of self-exploration, the idea that thinking for yourself is somehow an indulgence, or worse, maybe, a provocation. And it really made me wonder, why is the simple act of having a rich inner life becoming an act of resistance?
That is, well, it's profound observation, isn't it? Even if it sounds a bit clinically uncomfortable. But it really forces us, I think, to confront this reality that our psychological space, our ability to self-explore, to self-determine, it feels like it's under threat.
Yeah.
And when we talk about an inner life, what we're really talking about is genuine autonomy, right? Subjective experience, the capacity for self-reflection. When that gets minimized or externalized, well, the individual becomes incredibly susceptible to control.
And that's exactly what we want to get into today. It's the deep dive mission. We need to unpack this trend that the GP observed. We'll look at the political side, the devaluation of individual inner life and autonomy. We need to examine how different ideologies, both conservative and progressive, actually strategically weaponize psychological concepts.
Right. How self-exploration might be suppressed for compliance on one hand, or maybe reduced to just a performance tool on the other.
Exactly. And how that impacts individual autonomy, our mental well-being. And then there's the digital culture piece. How does that contribute to this erosion of genuine selfhood?
Fostering that need for external validation over, real self-exploration or critical thinking.
Right. And ultimately, we have to figure out why this quiet war on the mind seems to be leading to such profoundly diminished empathy, these mental health crises.
It feels like it's happening across different cultural contexts, too. Okay, so let's start there. Let's unpack this political dimension first. Because like I said, the doctor's observation was rooted in political alignment and behavior. So if we look at things like compliance, group dynamics, how is the political world actively discouraging what we might call internal motivation? That self-direction that really makes up a rich inner life.
Well, I think we have to start with the fundamental psychology of motivation. Specifically self-determination theory, or SDT.
SDT,
yeah. SDT basically tells us that compliance, getting people to follow rules or guidelines, is strongest when it's internally motivated.
Meaning we internalize a behavior. Could be a law, a health mandate, a social norm, whatever. We accept it because it aligns with our personal values, our goals, or our sense of importance.
So it feels like our choice, in a way.
Exactly. That's intrinsic motivation. The moment compliance relies purely on external pressure, fear of punishment, public shaming, maybe just mandated rules without any context, it becomes extrinsic.
And that's less effective.
Much less stable. It requires constant surveillance, frankly, and it breeds resentment. It actually pushes people toward resistance, not compliance.
Okay, so if compliance is intrinsically motivated, that means I've done the internal work myself, right? I've decided this rule is relevant to me. But in these really highly polarized political environments we see now, that kind of internalization seems almost impossible, especially if the rule comes from the other side.
That's precisely where this crucial study on COVID-19 compliance comes in. It gives us a really sharp lesson. Researchers looked at the pandemic response across 4 key states. They examined how political polarization impacted whether people actually followed health safety guidelines.
And what did they find?
The central finding was pretty stark. Polarization drastically reduced compliance. And the reason wasn't just disagreement with the rules themselves. It was because individuals perceived the decision-making processes of the opposing political administrations as, well, fundamentally unsupportive of their autonomy.
So it's the process, not just the rule. That's key. It wasn't simply, say, rejecting masks or distancing. It was rejecting the legitimacy of how that rule is created. Like, they felt the ruling party didn't respect their individual judgment.
Precisely. And this speaks directly to a concept called participatory fit. For any kind of governance, really, but especially during a crisis, legitimacy hinges on how transparent, unbiased, and fair the decision-making process appears to be. This is what we call autonomy support, or more formally, procedural justice support for self-determination, PJSD.
PJSD. Caught it.
So if the government fails to demonstrate high PJSD, meaning maybe they don't incorporate stakeholder input, or the rules seem totally arbitrary or biased, it directly undermines the individual's willingness to internalize those rules.
You just get rejected.
Yeah, they're seen as illegitimate political tools, not necessary safety measures.
But isn't it also true that the political parties themselves often use these psychological concepts, or maybe the lack of them, as strategic weapons? It doesn't always feel like an accident. It feels like, as you said, strategic political weaponization of psychology.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the strategic use of enforcement, for instance, making a rule mandatory, adding penalties. Psychologically, that's risky. It usually risks backfiring because it tends to replace that internal motivation with simple fear.
Right.
However, it doesn't necessarily backfire if, and this is the key part, if it's legitimized by perceived autonomy support. If people feel the process was fair, even enforcement can be accepted.
That suggests we really need to look at how enforcement was received differently by the two main groups who often hold fundamentally different views on authority and regulation to begin with.
Yes, and the study observed two very distinct reactions. Let's take the Republican enforcement dynamic first. This group, generally speaking, tends to reject mandatory enforcement as an overreach of individual liberty.
Okay.
For them, compliance only increased when mandatory guidelines were paired with high perceived PJSD, high fairness, high transparency.
So they needed that procedural justice piece.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They required that transparency, that fairness, clear, unbiased reasoning to overcome their sort of baseline ideological resistance to the mandate itself. If the process felt shady or biased, mandatory enforcement immediately decreased their sense of security and their acceptance. It led to lower compliance overall.
Wow.
They basically needed the government to honor their need for procedural justice before they'd grant legitimacy to the rule.
It sounds like they were demanding, in a way, that their inner life, their individual judgment, their self-determination be respected before they would willingly give up some external freedom. It's like a transaction based on trust in the process.
That's a good way to put it. Now, compare that to the Democrat enforcement dynamic observed in the same study. Democrats, who often desired stronger regulations and protections during the pandemic, actually responded positively to mandatory enforcement, even when the perceived PJSD, the perceived transparency or fairness of the administration, was low.
Really? So if they already autonomously endorse the enforcement itself, if they believe strongly in the need for that regulation, then how fair they thought the leader was mattered less.
Exactly. The enforcement action itself was already aligned with their pre-existing internal motivations and values. So it didn't feel oppressive to them. It felt protective, necessary.
The internalization happened before the mandate, essentially.
Yes. And the insight here is crucial, and maybe a bit chilling. When polarization gets this extreme, the system, often quite knowingly, I suspect, operates specifically to strip the opposing individual of that inner motivation to comply. How? Precisely by making the governmental process feel illegitimate and unsupportive of their personal autonomy.
So the political field itself becomes this constant external force, shaping whether your compliance feels like an act of self-determination or just forced obedience.
That's the dynamic.
Okay, so if the political process is almost designed to constantly undermine the opposing side's sense of autonomy, constantly trigger these adversarial responses, we're basically talking about a society in a state of perpetual psychological warfare.
That's not too strong a term, I think.
What is the societal cost then? When we live in this sustained high-conflict environment, it feels like it has to lead to a profound collapse of our shared emotional architecture.
It leads directly, I believe, to effective polarization. And we need to be really clear about the distinction here. We're not necessarily seeing a massive increase in ideological polarization. It's not like we disagree fundamentally more on specific policy details than we used to.
Okay.
The crisis is effective. It's about emotional hostility.
So it's less about what you believe about, say, economic policy, and more about the visceral contempt, the moral condemnation, the outright hatred you feel for the person who belongs to the other party.
That's exactly right. And the studies bear this out. The effective distance, that degree of emotional coldness, animosity between partisans, has grown far, far faster than their ideological divergence.
Wow.
What people feel about their opponents now matters much more than what they believe about the issues.
And when identity replaces ideology like that,
Yeah.
that's where you get this concept of identity fusion, right? When you talk about the individual's inner life being suppressed, I imagine this fusion is kind of the mechanism where the group just consumes the self.
Mm-hmm. Identity fusion is, well, it's terrifyingly effective, frankly, because it makes your political affiliation the very anchor of your entire self-concept.
It's not just a group you belong to.
No. You develop this visceral sense of oneness with the in-group. This leads to extreme loyalty, naturally, and an increased willingness to make pretty significant sacrifices for the group. And critically, because your sense of self is now so intrinsically linked to the group, any threat to the group gets processed by your brain as a personal existential assault.
Oh, wow.
This creates this chronic, heightened emotional sensitivity. It manifests as immediate anger, immediate fear, whenever you encounter the political opponent or their ideas.
So when the political other is constantly framed as an existential threat, we're moving way beyond rational debate. We're deep into the realm of neurological defense mechanisms. What does the neuroscience actually tell us about living under this constant threat level?
Yeah, the human brain just isn't designed for this kind of chronic, high-level political conflict. Polarization expertly exploits the brain's evolutionary threat system. When individuals are exposed again and again to threat-related stimuli, especially things framed as moral violations or perceived identity threats from the opposing side, the amygdala just lights up.
The brain's early warning system.
Exactly. And it forces this system to prioritize speed and defensiveness over nuanced thought. It ensures we are basically always primed for fight or flight when it comes to politics.
So we're essentially asking people to live every single day with their social alarms constantly blaring. What does that do to our capacity for empathy, for understanding someone on the other side?
It absolutely destroys it. This constant state of threat leads directly to what we can call empathic failure. Research shows that when individuals view members of socially distant or stigmatized groups, and this now very much includes the political outgroup, the medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC, shows reduced activation.
And the MPFC is the part of the brain we use for
perspective taking, for mentalizing, theory of mind, our ability to even imagine what someone else might be thinking or feeling.
So you're saying the brain literally starts to shut down the machinery required to see the opponent as a complex, feeling human being.
That's what the evidence suggests. This neurological distancing is why dehumanization becomes so much easier in these contexts. It aligns perfectly with moral exclusion theory. The outgroup gets pushed outside the boundaries of your moral community.
If you don't engage your MPFC to think about their perspective,
then they're no longer viewed as deserving the same moral consideration as your in-grip.
Yeah.
They become other.
And the cost. The sheer cost of maintaining this constant state of vigilance, this chronic emotional arousal, the fear, the anger, the moral indignation, it must be enormous for an individual's mental well-being. This feels like where the diminished empathy connects back to that GP's clinical finding about a lack of inner life.
The psychological toll is devastating. We see widespread emotional exhaustion. This is amplified by cognitive rigidity. Because the emotional stakes feel so incredibly high, people engage constantly in motivated reasoning.
Meaning they twist the facts.
They selectively interpret data only to confirm beliefs that protect their in-group identity. Anything that challenges it gets dismissed or ignored. And this chronic stress, day in, day out, results in allostatic overload.
Allostatic overload, that's a great technical term, but what does that actually look like for the average person listening? What's the cumulative wear and tear feel like?
Think of it like constantly running your car engine at the red line.
Yeah.
Allostasis is normally the body's ability to achieve stability through change, adapting to stress. Overload happens when the demands of adaptation just exceed the body's capacity to cope. Emotionally, this manifests as chronic fatigue, irritability, and inability to focus, a reduced capacity for self-regulation. Just feel worn out. When your inner resources are entirely consumed by managing external threat and protecting this externally defined identity, there's simply no psychological energy left.
No energy for what?
For genuine self-reflection, for vulnerability, for nurturing a messy, complex internal life. The self becomes purely reactive. vigilant and reactive.
Wow. Okay. So if the political realm is crowding out our inner life with this chronic threat and the demand for group-aligned obedience, the digital realm then, it performs a different kind of colonization, doesn't it? It seems to crowd it out with the constant demand for external validation. It turns the inner self into a kind of curated product for others to consume.
That's a perfect distinction, I think. We shift from a politics primarily driven by fear to a culture primarily driven by performance. And the strategic weaponization of psychological concepts changes focus. It moves from ensuring group loyalty to maximizing individual marketability, in a sense. This is that crucial shift from self-expression to self-curation.
Let's break that down a bit, the performance aspect. What is the fundamental difference between expressing yourself genuinely and, well, curating a self for the audience online?
Okay, so self-expression traditionally is rooted in genuine interest, right? Your inherent values, authentic participation in a cultural identity. It happens mostly on what sociologist Irving Goffman called the backstage, that private, unobserved space where we kind of work out who we really are. Self-curation, on the other hand, is almost entirely driven by anticipating how your choices will be perceived by others. It's mediated by algorithms, conducted entirely on the front stage, and the driving force is the pursuit of external validation, likes, followers, shares.
So that famous sociological distinction, front stage performance versus backstage authentic self. You're saying it just doesn't hold up anymore in the age of social media.
It completely collapses. For many people, especially younger generations steeped in digital culture, the performance is the reality. Identity doesn't start with introspection, with figuring things out backstage. It starts on the front stage. How do I want to be seen? What aesthetic do I want to inhabit? What can I leverage for validation?
So taste isn't about deep personal belief anymore.
Less so. It's more like a collection of algorithmically served, often temporary, aesthetics that you adopt and perform.
Okay, but if your sense of self is this fragile, curated product constantly on display, how do you protect it? Protect it from the inevitable scrutiny and criticism of the online world. Sincerity seems incredibly risky in that environment.
Sincerity is the ultimate vulnerability, absolutely. And this is why we see the significant rise of meta-irony, particularly among younger generations like Gen Z. Irony acts as a kind of psychological shield. By deliberately obscuring the true meaning or the seriousness of an action, individuals can perform while signaling that they know they are performing. So if someone calls them out, criticizes them, laughs at them, they can simply retreat into the irony. Oh, I wasn't serious, I was just messing around, or you just don't get the joke.
Ah, the fear of being labeled cringe. The fear of being judged as genuinely, unironically invested in something. That fear is powerful enough to actually suppress genuine enthusiasm or self-expression.
It seems to be, yes. The inner life, the genuine feeling, gets sacrificed to maintain this safe, emotional detachment.
It's an emotional and cognitive detachment mechanism, then.
Exactly. And the ultimate commodity in this ironic performance isn't even the content itself, but the lack of genuine commitment to the content. Which, of course, leads us right back to the need for external validation, those metrics, the likes, the followers that define success in this curated world.
We mentioned earlier the research showing that rush of self-esteem people get from a thumbs up on social media. Why is that rush so potent for most people?
Because for many, maybe most, self-esteem has become entirely contingent on that external feedback. They become psychologically malleable. If your self-worth relies on getting that daily validation from the outside world, your self-esteem is incredibly volatile. It spikes with positive feedback, sure, but it plummets with absence or criticism.
That sounds exhausting.
It creates a psychological environment where the individual is perpetually dependent on external algorithms and, frankly, the judgment of strangers.
But the research you mentioned also isolated a group that seemed immune to this volatility, the ones with the purpose buffer, you called it. They noticed the positive feedback, the likes, but they didn't rely on it to feel good about themselves.
That's correct. People with a strong sense of purpose showed remarkable rigidity, actually, persistence against the volatility of external opinion. And the researchers defined this purpose pretty clearly. It's an ongoing motivation that is self-directed, oriented toward the future, and importantly, often beneficial to others beyond the self.
So people who generally agree with statements like, to me, all the things I do are worthwhile, or I have reasons for living.
Exactly. Those kinds of sentiments reflect an underlying sense of purpose that transcends immediate gratification or external approval.
So if I have my own internal metric of value, my purpose, then the external metric of a like or a critical comment just becomes less relevant to my core self-worth.
Precisely. Purpose provides crucial psychological ballast. It allows individuals to inhibit those impulsive responses to immediate rewards, which is absolutely essential for long-term persistence and well-being. Think about it. If you lack purpose, an immediate positive reward can actually lead to self-sabotage.
How so?
Well, for instance, getting high praise on an early assignment might lead a student without a strong sense of purpose to slack off, right? Thinking, oh, I've got this, I don't need to study anymore. They sacrifice the larger downstream goal for the immediate comfort of that fleeting success.
Whereas someone with purpose stays focused on the bigger picture.
Yes. Purpose keeps the individual emotionally steady. It protects the structural integrity of the inner self, you could say, from the constant chaos of external validation signals.
Okay. So we've got these two really profound forces eroding our autonomy, our inner life. The political realm demanding compliance, often through threat and identity fusion, and the digital realm demanding performance, driven by external validation and self-curation. And both seem to lead back towards that doctor's clinical finding, a depleted, reactive, and ultimately kind of shallow inner life.
And now I think we really need to connect this erosion to its deeper philosophical roots. Because the doctor's observation, that feeling that some people seem to lack an inner life, it's actually, in a way, the realization of a much older, more foundational ideology. It's the quiet triumph of the mechanistic worldview, which, you could argue, systematically waged war on the mind long before the internet or modern partisan politics ever existed.
That seems counterintuitive, though. Didn't mechanistic science promise more autonomy, more freedom through reason?
It did. That was the promise. Yeah. But the dominant strain of thought, especially when mechanistic science sort of degenerated into an ideology, small science, it ended up doing the opposite. This ideology insists on ignoring, or at least devaluing, the subjective experience, the ethical reality of the individual.
How does it do that?
By reducing the person, including their consciousness, their complex inner life, all of it, to basically an insignificant, quasi-unreal byproduct of material biochemical processes in the brain. The mind is just seen as an epiphenomenon of matter. Nothing special.
So if the mind is just a collection of material processes, like a complex machine, then it has no inherent agency, no intrinsic meaning. It's just a biological resource to be optimized or maybe controlled.
Exactly. And the result of this kind of reductionist separation, cutting humanity off from nature, from spiritual meaning, from genuine, deep connection with others, is this profound and pervasive sense of meaninglessness, loneliness, fragmentation. And this creates what the philosopher Hannah Arendt famously termed the atomized subject.
The atomized subject.
Yeah, the individual isolated from society, stripped of strong communal bonds, often devoid of internal sources of meaning. And this, Arendt argued, is the elementary component. It's the necessary prerequisite, even for the totalitarian state.
Wow. That is a critical linkage. The philosophical devaluation of the inner world literally prepares the psychological ground for political control later on.
And furthermore, this idealization of the human intellect, this obsession with empirical control, it didn't actually alleviate societal suffering or fear, did it? If anything, it intensified the fear of disease, suffering, existential uncertainty, because there was no longer a shared, transcendent framework for meaning to help people cope. Interhuman relationships became marked by this chronic confusion and uncertainty.
So how does this collective anxiety then manifest? When society is populated by millions of these atomized subjects, if they're intensely fearful but isolated, they must try somehow to regain control, right?
They do. And that anxiety tends to be managed, or attempted to be managed, through two intense and ultimately self-defeating control mechanisms: narcissism and what's been called regulation mania.
Okay, explain those.
Narcissism here is the internal control mechanism. It's an intense, often fragile overinvestment in one's self-image, one's uniqueness, trying to compensate for that underlying meaninglessness. Look at me, I'm special. Regulation mania is the external mechanism, demanding more order, more predictability, more rules to try and control a world that feels fundamentally confused and chaotic.
But you said these attempts at control are self-defeating. They only make the problem worse.
Exactly. Narcissism and regulation mania inevitably intensify the very problem they're trying to solve. They create a psychologically exhausted, increasingly isolated, and deeply fearful population. And when the atomized subject reaches this level of profound exhaustion and disconnection, paradoxically, they begin to crave an absolute unifying master, some kind of structure or narrative to finally give their life form and meaning.
And this exhausted, fragmented population, this is the perfect breeding ground, then, for mass formation.
Precisely. Mass formation is what can happen when a society that's become saturated with radical individualism, rationalism, and atomization suddenly, dramatically tilts toward radically irrational collectivism. It's the psychological mechanism where the collective voice, the group narrative, completely overwhelms individual critical thought. It's a state where, to use a classical analogy, Dionysus, the god of irrational frenzy, violently overthrows Apollo, the god of reason and order.
Okay, what are the specific psychological conditions that need to be widespread in the population for this kind of sudden radical shift to actually occur?
Researchers who study this phenomenon, like Matthias Desmet, identify 4 key conditions. First, pervasive loneliness, social isolation, and a real lack of authentic social bonds. People feel disconnected.
Right.
Second, a widespread, almost structural lack of meaning or purpose in life.
Okay.
Third, a large amount of free-floating anxiety and psychological discomfort that isn't really attached to a specific concrete threat. It's just there.
A general sense of unease.
Yeah. And fourth, a great deal of latent, free-floating frustration and aggression that's just looking for an outlet.
Goodness. Those sound exactly like the pathologies generated by the collapse of the inner life we've been tracking all along. The social isolation from atomization, the anxiety from chronic political polarization, the lack of meaning from that mechanistic worldview.
They are indeed the symptoms waiting for a cure, so to speak. And the catalyst for mass formation is often a simple suggestion offered in the public sphere, usually a story, a narrative. It provides a unified object of anxiety, an immediate external target for all those pre-existing, free-floating pathologies. The anxiety, the aggression.
And the story doesn't even need to be true.
It doesn't need to be factually accurate at all. The masses often believe the story not because of its factual content, but because believing it provides a desperately needed new social bond. It instantaneously resolves that painful state of isolation. Feeling part of this group, united against this common enemy or problem, that shared identity becomes the only truth that matters.
And once that powerful collective identity is forged, the individual inner life is just completely surrendered to the group narrative.
Completely. It leads to really striking levels of authoritarianism and intolerance for any dissent. Individual reality, reason itself, must be adjusted to align perfectly with the ideological fiction. This formation, often driven by that underlying mechanistic ideology that sees human beings as just manipulable material, frequently moves society toward increasingly technological or perhaps biomedically controlled forms of governance. And crucially, the ultimate master in these situations isn't necessarily a specific elite group, but the ideology itself, the collective hypnosis that has consumed the isolated subject.
Wow. Okay, so we started this deep dive with a doctor observing a clinical finding, a lack of inner life in some people. We've tracked this observation through political systems that seem designed to erode autonomy through weaponized compliance and polarization, through digital systems that fragment the self, through the demands of external performance and validation, and down to a foundational mechanistic worldview that reduces human consciousness to just a resource to be managed or controlled. The crisis, it seems, is fundamentally about whether our subjective, messy, internal landscape is truly ours, or if it's just becoming a malleable biological resource waiting to be colonized by external forces.
It really does all circle back, doesn't it? Back to that core tension between external pressure and internal self-direction. The systems we inhabit, political, digital, even philosophical, seem to be actively trying to colonize the psychological space we need for genuine autonomy, for self-exploration. Perhaps the most provocative synthesis, then, is this. In a world where populist leaders often succeed by mobilizing collective emotions and threat perceptions, and where individual identity is increasingly mediated by algorithmic validation, the very act of cultivating a deep, self-directed sense of purpose, that ongoing, future-oriented motivation we talked about, becomes more than just a psychological defense mechanism. What does it become? It becomes perhaps the single most potent act of quiet resistance against this fragmentation and control. That sense of purpose provides the necessary psychological rigidity, that inner stability required to withstand a world increasingly built on malleability and fear. It ensures that your worth, and ultimately your compliance, is not contingent on what the crowd or the algorithm or the ruling ideology happens to dictate at any given moment. It anchors you within yourself.